They could see a group of people standing on the docks near the ferry. Some had their arms raised in the air, hands curled into fists. Their shouts were drowned out by the sounds of the car and sea, but their mouths were twisted, their eyes narrowed. Some carried signs that looked hastily made, bearing down legends as I saw something, I am saying something, and I am Antichrist, and absurdly, I didn't have anything clever to write. Their shouts died down when they saw the car approaching. Linus couldn't fault them for the looks of shock on their faces. He was sure that if he were standing on the shore watching a car driving along the surface of the ocean, he'd probably wear the same expression. The salt road ended at the beach near the docks. He brought the car to a halt on the sand, turning it off. The engine ticked. Silence fell. Then, at the front, the man from the ice cream shop, Norman, Linus thought with mild disdain, shouted, "They're using magic!" The crowd began to roar in earnest once more. Helen was standing at the front of the crowd on the dock as if to block them from gaining access to the ferry. She looked furious, her face smudged with dirt. Merle stood next to her, arms across his chest, a scowl on his face. Linus and Arthur exited the vehicle, slamming the doors shut behind them. Linus was relieved to see the crowd wasn't as large as it first appeared. There were perhaps a dozen people, including Helen and Merle. He wasn't surprised to see Marty from the record shop in the crowd, wearing a neck brace. He held a sign that said, "Yes, I was injured by the sign of the devil. Ask me how." Next to him was the man from the post office. Linus wasn't surprised. He never liked that fellow all that much to begin with. The shouts died once more as Linus and Arthur climbed the steps next to the dock, though they didn't die out completely. "What is the meaning of this?" Linus demanded as he reached the dock. "My name is Linus Baker, and I am in the employ of the department in charge of magical youth. Yes, that's correct, a government official. And when a government official wants answers, said answers had best be given as quickly as possible." "They tried to swarm my ferry," Merle said, eyeing the crowd, and Arthur with distaste in equal measure. "Said they wanted to get to the island. I wouldn't let them." "Thank you, Merle," Linus said, surprised at the ferryman's thoughtfulness. "I wouldn't have expected—" "They refused to pay me," Merle snapped. "I don't do nothing for free." Linus bit his tongue. "You shouldn't have come," Helen told Arthur. "I have this under control. I wouldn't let anything happen to you or the children." She glared at her nephew, who tried to slink back farther into the crowd. "Some people don't know when to keep their mouths shut. Or you can try and hide, Martin Smythe, but I see you. I see you very well. I see all of you, and I have a long, long memory." "I'm sure you have this well in hand," Arthur said, voice even, "but it always helps to have people by your side." Linus stepped forward. The sun was bright, causing him to sweat profusely. He glared at the group of people before him. He'd never seen the intimidating sort, much to his consternation, but he wasn't about to allow these people to do whatever had gotten stuck in their heads. "What is the meaning of this?" He felt a savage glee when the crowd took a step back as one. "Well, you seem to have a voice just fine until we arrived. Anyone? Surely someone is willing to speak." It was Norman who did. Linus wasn't surprised. "We want them gone," he growled. "The children, the orphanage, the island, all of it." Linus stared at him. "And how do you expect to rid yourselves of an entire island?" Norman flushed with rage, anger. You see, that's not the point." Linus threw up his hands. "Then what, pray tell, is the point?" Norman spluttered before saying, "The Antichrist child. He almost killed Marty." The crowd rumbled behind him in agreement. Norman nodded furiously. "Yeah, that's right. There Marty was, minding his own business when that thing came into town and threatened his life. Threw the poor sod against the wall like it was nothing. He's permanently injured. The fact that he's even walking is a miracle." Helen scoffed. "Permanently injured my arse." "Look at his neck brace," the postmaster cried. "No one wears a neck brace unless they have been seriously hurt." "Really?" Helen said, because that neck brace seems to be the exact one I had in my closet at home that I was given after a car accident years ago. It's not, Marty exclaimed. I went to the doctor, and he gave it to me after telling me that my spine was mostly powder and I was lucky to be alive. That I believe, Linus muttered. You would be spineless. Helen rolled her eyes. Martin, there's a tag on the back. It has my initials on it. You forgot to tear it off. We can all see it. Oh, Martin said. Well, that's merely a coincidence? It doesn't matter, Norman said hotly. We have all decided the children are a menace. They represent a danger to us all. We've abided long enough with their wickedness. What happens if they come for the rest of us, just as they did Marty? Did he tell you that he tried to take a small child into a locked room by himself in an attempt to exorcise him? Linus asked. Because I'm positive there are laws against kidnapping and attempted assault, regardless of who the child may be. The crowd turned slowly to look at Marty. Marty found something awfully curious at the ground beneath his feet. Norman shook his head. His actions were misguided, but the point remains the same. Are we not allowed to protect ourselves? You say they're children. Fine, but we have our own children to worry about. Strange, Helen said, coming to stand next to Linus, because not a single one of you is a parent. Norman was getting worked up again. That's because they were too afraid to be here. Name one, Helen said. Norman said, I won't have you trying to trick me. I know you don't see it, Helen, and that's on you, but we won't allow our lives to be threatened when... Linus laughed bitterly. Threatened? By whom? Who in the world has threatened you aside from me? They have, a woman cried at the back of the crowd. By simply existing, they're a threat. I don't believe you, Linus said. I have been by their side for a month, and I have heard nary a whisper of a threat. In fact, the only time I've ever thought there was danger aside from Marty's ill-advised attempt against a child was from you lot here. Say you crossed to the island. What would you do? Would you lay your hands upon them? Would you strike them, hurt them, kill them? Norman paled. That's not what we... Then what are you doing? Because surely you have some idea. You have gathered yourselves in a crowd, working yourselves up in a tizzy. Your groupthink has poisoned you, and I hate to wonder what would have happened had you gained access to the island. I never thought I'd say this, but thank Christ Merle was here to refuse your passage on his ferry. Yeah, Merle said, I told you payment was required, but you refused. Honestly, Merle, Helen said, learn to keep your mouth shut when you're receiving soft praise. Why don't you? Disperse, Linus said, or I will do everything in my power to make sure... He couldn't see who it came from. Someone in the middle of the crowd. He didn't think it was Marty, but it happened quickly. A hand raised, and clutched in its finger was a large rock. The hand pulled back before jerking forward, the rock flying toward them. Linus didn't have time to consider who it had been aimed for, but Helen was in the path. He moved in front of her, his back to the crowd, shielding her. He closed his eyes and waited for impact. It never came. Instead, it was as if the sun had crashed to the earth. The air grew warmer and warmer until it felt like it was on fire. He opened his eyes, his face inches from Helen's, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring up above him in wonder, her eyes reflecting waves of fire. He turned slowly. Standing between them and the crowd was Arthur Parnassus. Though not as he'd been, the phoenix had risen. His arms spread wide away from him. The wings Linus had glimpsed briefly in the darkened cellar were stretched at least 10 feet on either side of Arthur. Fire crawled up and down his arms and shoulders. Above him, the head of the phoenix pulled back, the rock held in its beak. It bit down, shattering the rock into tiny pieces that rained down in front of Arthur. There was fear in the people before them, yes, fear that wouldn't be cured by such a display, even one as magnificent as this. But it was tempered by the same wonder he'd seen in Helen, the same wonder he was sure was on his own face. The wings fluttered, fire cackling. The phoenix tilted its head back and cried out a piercing shriek that warmed Linus to his core. Linus left Helen standing on the dock. He circled Arthur slowly, ducking under one of the wings, feeling the heat of them on his back. Arthur was staring straight ahead, his eyes burning. The phoenix flapped its wings, little tendrils of fire spinning off. It cocked its head as it stared down at Linus, eyes blinking slowly. Without a second thought, Linus reached up and cupped Arthur's face. His skin was hot, but Linus wasn't afraid of being singed and blackened. Arthur would never allow it. The fire tickled against the backs of his hands. There, there, Linus said quietly. That's enough of that, I think. You've made your point quite well. The fire faded from Arthur's eyes. The wings pulled back. The phoenix lowered its head toward them. Linus looked up at it and gasped when the great bird pressed its beak against his forehead momentarily, before it too was gone in a thick plume of black smoke. You've gone and done it now, Linus whispered. It was time, Arthur said. Sweat dripped down his forehead and his face was pale. All right? Quite. I'd like to avoid a rock upside the head if at all possible, so it's much appreciated. He dropped his hands, aware that they still had an audience. He was angrier than he'd been in a long time. He started to turn to give them a piece of his mind, to threaten them within an inch of their lives, but stopped when Arthur shook his head. You've had your say. Let me. Linus nodded tightly, though he didn't leave Arthur's side. He glared at the crowd, daring any of them to throw another rock. Whatever fight had been in them had gone. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale. Their signs lay forgotten on the ground. Marty had removed his neck brace, probably because he'd wanted to look up and see the phoenix unleashed. Arthur said, I don't know you as well as I'd like, and you don't know me. If you did, you would have known that attempting to harm me and mine is never a good idea. Linus grew warm again, though the phoenix was gone. The crowd took another step back. Arthur sighed, shoulders slumping. I don't know what to do here. I don't know what to say. I'm under no impression that words alone will change hearts and minds, especially when those words come from me. You fear what you don't understand. You see us as chaos to the ordered world you know, and I haven't done much to fight that, given how isolated I've kept the children on the island. Perhaps if I'd... He shook his head. We make mistakes. Constantly. It's what makes us human, even if we're different from one another. You see us as something to be feared, and for the longest time, I've seen you as nothing but living ghosts from a past I'd give anything to forget. But this is our home and one we share. I won't beg, I won't plead, and if push comes to shove, I will do what I must to ensure the safety of my wards. But I hope to avoid that, if at all possible. Instead, I'll ask you to listen instead of judging that which you don't understand. He looked to Marty, who shrank back. Lucy meant you no real harm, he said, not unkindly. If he had, your insides would be on your outside. Perhaps a little less, Linus muttered as the crowd gasped in unison. Too right, Arthur said, then louder. Now, not that he'd ever do that. All he wanted was his records. He does love them so, regardless of what else he is. He is still a child, as they all are. And don't all children deserve to be protected, to be loved and nurtured so that they may grow and shape the world to make it a better place? In that way, they are no different than any other child in the village or beyond. But they're told they are by people such as yourselves and people who govern them in your world, people who put rules and restrictions in place to keep them separated and isolated. I don't know what it will take to change that, if anything, but it won't start at the top. It'll start with us. The crowd watched him warily. Arthur sighed. I don't know what else to say. I do, Helen said, stepping forward. She was furious, her hands balled into fists. You have the right to assemble peacefully. You have the right to express your opinions, but the moment it crosses the line into violence, it becomes a matter of legality. Magical youth are protected by law, as all children are. Any harm that comes to them will be met with the swiftest of consequences. I'll make sure of it. I'll do my level best to make sure anyone who lays a hand on a child, magical or not, will wish they hadn't. You may think you can shrug off anything Linus or Arthur says, but mark my words. If I even catch a whiff of further discord, I will show you why I'm not to be trifled with. Norman was the first to react. He stormed off, pushing his way through the crowd, muttering to himself. The postmaster followed, though he glanced back over his shoulder, a stunned expression on his face. A few more walked away after them. Marty tried to leave too, but Helen said, "Martin Smythe, you stay right where you are. You and I are going to have a very long conversation about proper etiquette in group settings and the penalties of lying. And if it was you who threw that rock, I'm going to drain your trust fund and donate it all to charity." "You can't," Marty wailed. "I can," Helen said primly. "I'm the trustee, and it would be very, very easy." The crowd dispersed. Linus was startled when a few people muttered apologies toward Arthur, though they kept their distance. He expected news of what they'd seen to spread through the village rapidly. He wouldn't be surprised if the story would eventually end up as Arthur having turned into a monstrous bird and threatening to burn their skin from their bones and destroy the village. Merle said, "I'll take you back to the island if you want, half price." Linus snorted. "I think we'll be fine, Merle, but thank you for your generosity." He paused, considering. "And I really mean that." Merle grumbled under his breath about a salt road putting him out of business as he walked down the dock toward his ferry. Arthur was watching the people walk away toward the village. "Do you think they'll listen?" he asked Helen. Helen frowned. "I don't know. I hope so, but then I hope for many things that don't always come to be." She looked at him almost shyly. "Your feathers were very pretty." He smiled. "Thank you, Helen, for all that you've done." She shook her head. "Give me time, Arthur. Give all of us time. I'll do what I can." She squeezed his hand before turning to Linus. "Off then. Saturday, right?" He blinked. In all the excitement, he'd forgotten his journey was almost at an end. "Yes," he said, "Saturday." "I see." She looked between Arthur and Linus. "I do hope you find yourself back here again one day, Mr. Baker. It's certainly eventful when you're around. Safe travels." And with that, she moved down the dock, grabbing Martin by the ear and pulling him away, much to his righteous indignation. Linus moved next to Arthur. The backs of their hands brushed together. "How did it feel?" he asked. "What?" "Stretching your wings." Arthur turned his face toward the sun, lips quirking slightly. "Like I was free for the first time in a very long time." "Come, my dear Linus, let's go home. I'm sure Zoe has her hands full. I'll drive." "Home," Linus echoed, wondering just where that could actually be. They headed back toward the car. Moments later, they were on the salt road, the wind in their hair, the Cerulean Sea lapping at the tires. Chapter 17. On Friday afternoon, there was a knock at the door of the guest house. Linus looked up from his final report. He'd been working on it most of the day. He'd only written a single sentence after the customary introduction. He stood from his chair and went to the door. He was surprised to find the children of Marsyas Orphanage standing on the porch. They were dressed as if ready for an adventure. "I have returned," Commander Lucy crowed, "for one last expedition, Mr. Baker. I am asking you to join us. The perils will be great, and I cannot promise you'll get out of this alive. I have received word there are man-eating snakes and insects that will burrow under your skin and chomp your eyeballs from the inside out. But the reward, should you survive, will be more than even your wildest dreams. Do you accept?" "I don't know," Linus said slowly. "Man-eating snakes, you say? Sounds dangerous." Lucy glanced back at the others before he leaned forward and whispered, "They're not real. I'm just playing, but don't tell the others." "Ah," Linus said, "I see. Well, it just so happens that I am an expert in man-eating snakes, especially in ways to avoid them. I suppose I should come along to make sure nothing happens to you." "Oh, thank God," Chauncey sighed. "I didn't want to get eaten today." "Go change," Talia said, showing Linus back into the house. "You can't go dressed like that." "I can't? What's wrong with—" He stiffened and slumped. "Oh, no. I don't think I can take another step. Is it the flesh-burrowing insects?" "Why are you like this?" Talia growled. "Fee, help me." Fee bellowed and ran forward, throwing her negligible weight against Linus. He snorted as he took another step forward toward the bedroom. "Much better. Thank you. I'll be out in a flash." He listened to the children chatter excitedly about the upcoming adventure as he went into the bedroom. He shut the door behind him and leaned against it, tilting his head back and closing his eyes. "You can do this," he whispered. "Come on, old boy, one last adventure." He pushed himself away from the door and went to the closet. He found the adventurer clothes. He put them on. He still looked absolutely ridiculous, and for once, he found he didn't care at all. The adventurers traipsed their way through the jungle. They fended off cannibals that attacked with spears and arrows and thinly veiled threats to eat their spleens. They snuck by man-eating snakes hanging like thick vines from the trees. Commander Lucy was overtaken by insects that were going to burrow behind his eyes. He gasped and gagged and flailed around, finally collapsing against a tree, his tongue hanging from his mouth. It was only thanks to his troops that he was able to be revived at the last possible moment, living to fight another day. They eventually made their way to familiar ground, and in the distance Linus could see a copse of trees that hid the house of an island sprite. They came out of the tree line and onto the beach just as her voice boomed around them. "I see you have returned. You are truly foolish. You barely escaped with your lives last time." "Hark!" Commander Lucy cried. "You won't get the best of us. We demand that you relinquish your treasures. We won't take no for an answer." "You won't?" "No!" the children shouted. "No," Linus echoed quietly. "Oh, well, then I suppose I might as well give up now. You're far too strong for the likes of me." "I knew it," Lucy breathed fervently. He raised his hands above his head. "Men," he glanced back at Talia and Fee, "and also women, follow me to your just reward." They did. Of course they did. They would follow him anywhere. Linus would too. They charged across the beach and into the trees. Linus sighed. He wasn't going to charge anywhere. His charging days were pretty much over. He wiped his brow and trudged toward the trees. He frowned once he reached the tree line. It had grown strangely silent. 6 children should have been making much more noise, especially these 6 children. He hesitated, but then stepped into the trees. Paper lanterns had been hung from the branches. They were the same ones that had been hung in the gazebo. He reached up and pressed a hand against one of them. The light inside was bright, and he didn't think it came from a bulb or a candle. They were waiting for him as he reached the house in the middle of the trees. Talia and Fee, Sal, Theodore, Chauncey, and Lucy, Zoe, the flowers in her hair green and gold, and Arthur, of course, always Arthur. They held a sign out in front of them, a long roll of paper with painted words that read, "We'll miss you, Mr. Baker." There were handprints on it, little ones for Talia and Fee and Lucy, a bigger one for Sal, a line that he thought came from Chauncey's tentacles, and a drip of paint that looked like a claw from Theodore. Linus took in a shuddering breath. I didn't expect this. What a wonderful thing you've done. Look at it. Look at you." "It was my idea," Lucy said. Talia stomped on his foot. He winced. "Well, mostly all my idea. The others helped, though. A little." He brightened. "But guess what?" "What?" "There was no treasure after all. It was a lie to get you here for your party." "Oh, I see. So the real treasure was the friendships we made along the way." "You guys are the worst," Lucy muttered. "The literal worst." And what a party it was. There was food, so much so that Linus thought the table would collapse under the weight of it. There was roast and hot rolls and salad with cucumbers that crunched between their teeth. There was cake and pie and bowls of tart raspberries they could dip in cream. And music, all kinds of music. There was a record player sitting on the counter, and the day the music died was bright and loud with Richie and Buddy and the Big Bopper singing from beyond. Lucy was in charge, and he never failed to disappoint. They laughed on this day. Oh, how they laughed. Even though Linus thought his heart was breaking, he laughed until there were tears in his eyes, until he was sure his sides would split. As the sun began to set and the lanterns grew brighter, they laughed and laughed and laughed. Linus was wiping tears away from amusement, he told himself, when the music changed yet again. He recognized it even before Nat King Cole began to sing. He looked up to see Arthur Parnassus standing before him, hand outstretched. "Thank you. You keep saying that, and I don't know if it's deserved. I know you don't believe you do, but I don't say things I don't mean. Life is too short for it. Do you like to dance? I don't know. I think I might have 2 left feet, honestly. I highly doubt that. And Linus Baker allowed himself to be selfish just this once. He took Arthur's hand and stood slowly as Nat told him to smile, even though his heart was breaking. Arthur pulled him close and they began to sway back and forth. Smile, and maybe tomorrow, Arthur whispered in his ear, you'll see the sun come shining through for you. Linus lay his head against Arthur's chest. He could feel the heat from him burning from the inside out. They danced. It stretched on for what felt like ages, though Linus knew the song didn't last long. He heard Arthur whispering the words to him. He surprised even himself. Apparently, he didn't have 2 left feet after all. But, like all things magical, the song eventually came to an end. The house around them was quiet. Linus blinked as if waking from a dream. He lifted his head. Arthur looked down at him, eyes glittering like fire. Linus stepped back. Zoe sat with Fee and Talia in her lap. Theodore was perched on Sal's shoulder. Lucy and Chauncey lay pressed against the legs. All of them looked tired. Happy, but tired. Lucy smiled at him, but it broke when he yawned. Do you like your treasures, Mr. Baker? Linus, looked up at Arthur again. I did, he whispered. I liked it more than anything. Zoe carried Fee and Talia as they walked back toward the main house. Talia was snoring loudly. Sal had put Theodore in his shirt and the wyvern's head lay against his throat. Arthur held Chauncey by his tentacles. Linus brought up the rear, Lucy sleepy in his arms. He wished it could last forever. It was over in what seemed like an instant. He said goodnight to Talia, to Fee, to Sal and Theodore. He shifted Lucy to one arm and reached down and patted Chauncey on the top of the head. Arthur asked a question with his eyes. Linus shook his head. I've got him. Arthur nodded and turned to remind the others it was time to brush their teeth. He took Lucy into Arthur's bedroom and set him down. Go get your pajamas on, he said quietly. Lucy nodded and turned toward the closet door. He shut it behind him. Linus stood in the middle of the room, unsure of anything. He thought he knew the way of things, how the world worked, his place in it. Now he wasn't so sure. Lucy returned in pajama pants and a white shirt. His hair was sticking up as if he'd run his hand through it. His bare feet were so small. Go brush your teeth, Linus instructed gently. Lucy looked up at him suspiciously. You'll be here when I get back? Linus nodded. I promise. Lucy went back out into the hall. He heard Chauncey yell that Theodore was eating the toothpaste again, and Theodore chirping in response that he was not. Linus put his face into his hands. He'd composed himself by the time Lucy came back into the room, face freshly scrubbed. He yawned again. I'm so tired, he said. Adventuring is hard work, I suspect. Good adventure, though. The best, Linus agreed. He took Lucy by the hand and led him to his room. The records they'd glued meticulously back together were hung on the wall, though from the Buddy Holly record a piece they hadn't been able to find was still missing. Theodore had moved quickly, it would seem. Linus pulled the covers down on the bed, and Lucy crawled up and underneath, snuggling down into his pillow. Linus pulled the covers back up to his shoulders. Lucy turned on his side, looking up at Linus. I don't want you to go. Linus swallowed thickly as he crouched down next to the bed. I know, and I'm sorry about that, but my time here is just about finished. Why? Because I have responsibilities. Why? Because I'm an adult, and adults have jobs. Lucy grimaced. I never want to be an adult. It sounds boring. He reached out and brushed a lock of Lucy's hair from his brow. I think you'll make a fine adult, though it won't happen for a long time to come. You're not going to let them take us away, are you? Lucy shook his head. No, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. You will? Yes, Lucy. Oh, that's nice of you. Then, you're going to be gone when I wake up? Linus looked away, but he didn't answer. He felt Lucy's hand brush against his face. The others don't know, but I do. I can see things sometimes. I don't know why. You, Arthur, he burns. Did you know that? Linus inhaled sharply. Did he tell you that? No, I don't think he's allowed, but we know. We all know. Just like we know what you both did when you left the other day. He's one of us, just like you. I'm afraid I don't have magic. You do, Mr. Baker. Arthur told me that there can be magic in the ordinary. He looked back at Lucy. His eyes were closed. He breathed deeply. Linus stood. Thank you, he whispered. He made sure to leave the door open a little when he left so that a sliver of light shone in to chase away the nightmares should they try and find the sleeping boy. The other doors were all closed. He touched each of them as he wandered slowly down the hall. The only light that was on came from under Sal's door. He thought about knocking. He didn't. He paused at the top of the stairs, took a breath, and then descended. There was a whispered argument occurring on the first floor. He hesitated, unsure if he should make his presence known. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he knew it wasn't for him. Zoe stood at the front door, jabbing Arthur in the chest, her brow furrowed, her eyes narrowed. She looked unhappy, not quite angry, but something. She stopped when the last step creaked under Linus. They looked over at him. Lucy's asleep, he said, scratching the back of his neck. Men, Zoe growled. Useless, the lot of you. She stepped away from Arthur, her expression tight as she glared at Linus. Bright and early, then? Linus nodded. Train leaves at 7 sharp. Merle is expecting us at 6:15. And you just have to be on it, don't you? He said nothing. Fine, she muttered. I'll be there. Don't keep me waiting. She whirled on her heels and left without saying anything else. She left the door wide open. Arthur stared after her, jaw clenched. Everything all right? No, I don't think it is. His head hurt. If you're both worried about my final report, let me assure you that it's not about the damn report. Okay, Linus said slowly. He wasn't sure he'd ever heard Arthur curse before. Then what is it? Arthur shook his head. Stubborn, Linus muttered, and he couldn't help how fond he sounded. He didn't know what else to do, so he did the only thing he could. He walked toward the door. He thought something would happen the moment he was shoulder to shoulder with Arthur. What he didn't know. But it didn't. He was a coward. Good night, then, he managed to say. He continued on to the door, and then Arthur said, Stay. He stopped as he closed his eyes. His voice was shaky when he asked, What? Stay. Here. With us. Stay here with me. Linus shook his head. You know I can't. No, I don't. I don't know that. Linus turned and opened his eyes. Arthur was pale, his mouth in a little line. Linus thought he could see the faint outline of burning wings behind him, but it might have just been a trick of the low light. It was always temporary, Linus said. I don't belong here. If you can't belong here, then where can you belong? I have a life, Linus said. I have a home. A home isn't always the house we live in. It's also the people we choose to surround ourselves with. You may not live on the island, but you can't tell me it's not your home. Your bubble, Mr. Baker. It's been popped. Why would you allow it to grow around you again? I have a job to do, he finished lamely. People are counting on me, not just here. There are other children who could need me, who could be in the same position you were in once. Shouldn't I do everything I can to help them? Arthur nodded tightly as he glanced away. Of course, that's what's important. Forgive me. I didn't mean to make it sound like it wasn't. When he looked at Linus again, his expression was smooth, almost blank. He bowed slightly. Thank you, Linus, for everything, for seeing us for who we really are. You will always be welcome on the island. I know the children will miss you. The expression stuttered lightly. I know I will miss you. Linus opened his mouth, but nothing came out, and he despised himself for it. Here was this man, this wonderful man, exposing his heart. Linus had to give him something, no matter how small. He tried again. He said, if this were different, you have to know, Arthur. You have to. This place, these children, if only I could. Arthur smiled out quietly. I know. Good night, Linus, and safe travels. Do take care of yourself. He shut the door behind him, leaving Linus standing on the porch in the dark. Linus sat on the porch. There was a faint light in the east. The stars were bright. His luggage was beside him, Calliope too in her crate, though she wasn't amused at the early hour. Linus could commiserate, especially since he hadn't slept a wink. He took a deep breath. It came out in a mist. I think it's time. He stood. He grabbed his luggage in the crate and stepped off the porch. As promised, Zoe was waiting by her little car. She took his suitcase from him and set it on the trunk without a word. He climbed into the passenger seat, settling Calliope's crate on his lap. Zoe hopped in and started the car. Then they were off. Linus watched the house in the side mirror as it slowly shrank behind them. Merle was waiting in the docks. The headlights from the car illuminated his scowl. He lowered the gate. Rates for this early hour doubled, he said to himself. Linus surprised himself. Shut up, Merle. Merle's eyes widened. Linus didn't look back. Merle broke first, he grumbled as he walked back to the wheelhouse. The crossing was smooth. The ocean was nearly flat. The sky grew brighter. Zoe didn't speak. When they reached the village, Merle didn't even look at them as he lowered the gate. I expect you to come right back, Merle said as they exited the ferry. I have a busy day and... Zoe gunned the engine, and whatever else Merle had to say was lost. The train hadn't yet arrived when they reached the platform. The stars were disappearing as the sun started to rise. Linus could see the distant crashing of the waves as Zoe turned off the car. He flexed his hands on his knees. Zoe, She got out of the car and walked around to the back. He heard her open the trunk. He sighed as he pushed the door open. He fumbled with Calliope's crate, but managed to climb out without dropping her. Zoe set his luggage next to the platform before going back to the trunk and slamming it closed. I get it, he said. She laughed, though without humor. Do you? Because I wonder. I don't expect you to understand. She shook her head. Good, because I don't. I can't just stay here. There are rules to follow, regulations that must be... To hell with your rules and regulations. He gaped at her. Then he said the only thing he could. Life, it doesn't work that way. Why doesn't it? She snapped. Why can't life work whatever way we want it to? What's the point of living if you only do it how others want you to? It's the best we can do. She scoffed. And this is your best? This? He said nothing as the whistle of a coming train came from down the tracks. Let me tell you something, Linus Baker, she said, hands clenched on the top of the driver's door. There are moments in your life, moments when your chances have to be taken. It's scary because there's always the possibility of failure. I know that. Because once upon a time, I took a chance on a man that I had failed before. I was scared. I was terrified. I thought I might lose everything, but I wasn't living then. The life I had before wasn't living. It was getting by, and I will never regret the chances I took because it brought me to them, to all of them. I made my choice, and you're making yours. She opened the door and got in the car. The engine turned over. She looked back at him just once when she said, Don't you wish things could be different? Don't you wish you were here? He whispered, but she couldn't have heard him. By the time he finished speaking, she was away, sand kicking up from the tires. He stared at the orange phone on the platform while he waited for the train, thinking how easy it would be if he picked it up and made a call, to tell whoever answered he wanted to come back home. Just you then? The attendant asked cheerily as he stepped off the train. Don't usually see people leaving this late in the season. Going home, Linus muttered as he handed over his ticket. Ah, the attendant said, no place like home, or so I'm told. Me, I like riding the rails, all the wonderful things I see, you know. He glanced down at the ticket. Back to the city. I hear there's quite the storm there. Hasn't stopped raining in a dog's age. He grinned as he handed back the ticket. Help you with your luggage, sir? Linus blinked against the burn. Yes, fine, thank you. I'll take the crate. She doesn't like most people. The attendant peered down. Ah, I see. Yes, I'll take your luggage. The car you're in is right this way, sir. And luckily for you, it's empty. Not another soul in sight. Could get some sleep if you need it. he whistled as he lifted the suitcase and carried it onto the train. Linus looked down at the crate. Ready to go home? Calliope turned around and presented him with her backside. Linus sighed. 2 hours later, the first drops of rain began to fall.